All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, taking some time out of your day to be here with us. My name is Carrie Wiggum. I'm an assistant professor of genocide and mass atrocity prevention at Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, and we're really grateful that you're here to join us for this webinar. I want to begin by acknowledging that Binghamton University sits on the ancestral land of the Oneida and Onondaga nations. And I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral land of the Lenape. Thank you for joining us. As many of you know who have been with us for other webinars, this is a series of webinars that we've been offering to respond to our need to be together in whatever ways we can be in these strange times. I want to announce from the beginning that the next webinar after this one will be on Friday, April 16th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that will be on risks and realities of mass atrocities facing Brazil's indigenous peoples. That's going to include 4 Brazilians from academia, government, and indigenous activism. And it will be simultaneously broadcast translated or interpreted into English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So we hope that you will keep your eyes out for that and join us for that webinar as well. But now for what you're all here for, we are so honored to be joined today by Alice Nderitu, the newly appointed UN Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide. Alice Nderitu has been a recognized voice in the field of peace building and violence prevention, having led as mediator and senior advisor in reconciliation processes among communities in her country, Kenya, as well as in other African settings. She served as commissioner of the National Cohesion and Integration Commission in Kenya, as well as founding member and co-chair of the Uiano Platform for Peace, a prevention agency linking early warning to early response in Kenya. And we'll be talking more and hearing more about that, the Uiano Platform for Peace soon. She's also the founder of Community Voices for Peace and Pluralism, a network of African women professionals preventing, transforming, and solving violent, ethnic, racial, and religious conflicts worldwide. Her national experience includes serving as director for education for social justice at Fahamu, head of human rights education and capacity building programs for the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, and its predecessor body, the Standing Committee on Human Rights, as well as researcher and administrator of the Kenyan Prison Services for the Ministry of Home Affairs. She serves as member of the Kenya National Committee on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, War Crimes, Crimes Against Humanity, and all forms of discrimination, one of the first and most advanced national mechanisms for prevention that we've seen worldwide. And also the African Union's network of African women in conflict prevention and mediation. I should also tell you that I've had the pleasure of knowing Alice for several years now. We started to know each other years ago when Alice was a participant in one of the trainings that we hold at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, an NGO that I also work at. And now Alice has gone on to be a partner and an instructor with us for many years since then. She's long been one of our most impressive alumni and partners. And now with this new appointment, I can say that she's probably also the most illustrious of our alumni as well. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alice. So I'd love to begin by just having you speak a little bit about how you first got involved in the field of atrocity prevention. What experiences have been particularly formative for you?
Thank you very much, Kerry. I'm not sure about the illustrious bit. Yeah, but I must say that Auschwitz, the Auschwitz Institute, used to be for peace and reconciliation and now for the prevention of genocide, has played a very key role in laying the foundation for what I'm doing today as special advisor on the prevention of genocide. The readings actually and the physical visits to Auschwitz, and also also other spaces where so many of these kind of atrocities have happened, have really sharpened not just my sense of justice and my sense of peace as well, but also made me hunger to know more. So first, just to thank you very much and to acknowledge our friendship over the years. Thank you very much. So I came into the space of atrocity prevention initially from human rights to peace building, and then atrocity prevention, and then of course all are so interconnected. And starting with human rights, that's where I gained a very sharp awareness of how people were living in my country, Kenya. I worked for the Human Rights Commission, and I was in charge of the Human Rights Education Department. And my work involved a lot of travel around the country. And I was able to see the disparities, the inequalities. I was able to see what identity violence, and I mean violence in always structural and, in cultural, in always had visited upon some of the ethnic communities. And so my sense grew that I needed to do something about it. And so I would work on, at that time, we were conducting human rights education training in a context where our constitution then had nothing on human rights. So this was a completely, if I may say, like foreign concept, but foreign only to the extent that Kenya had ratified some conventions. For example, ECOSOC on economic and social cultural rights and on civil and political rights. So that's what we used to focus on, that Kenya has ratified the Convention Against Torture, Kenya has ratified, all this, and then we would teach communities about that. But, our system then in Kenya, and still now, is that for a convention to get into the country, it has to be domesticated into the laws, and quite a lot of that had not happened. So it was a very, very difficult dynamic that I was in. And I had come from a background of a mother and father who are very strongly rooted in justice, who feel very strongly, the rules of you have to tell the truth, you have to, those basics were very strong in our family. And also had come also from that space of seeing how power was exercised, and exercised unequally by both men and women. Men were very powerful in the space that I grew up in. And my mother always said that I was born in the middle of four boys. So and she always said that I was very stubborn, and she didn't know whether it came from being born in the middle of the four boys. But I always fought for my space, like among the four boys. So really, that's where it all began.
Thank you. I should tell everyone that we're going to be later taking questions. So if you have questions as you listen to Alice answer some of my questions, just enter them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So Alice, you mentioned that throughout your career, you've had a number of positions that have fallen into different categories, from human rights work, peace building, conflict prevention, and then there are still those of us working in the field, some people who really draw some strong divisions between those categories and say there really is a difference between conflict prevention and atrocity prevention. How do you respond to that argument? Do you see these as different fields? And if not, how are they connected for you?
Based on my experience and having worked on human rights and conflict prevention, and I should say violent conflict prevention, because conflict is not always violent, and atrocity prevention, I think the key thing is that they come from the same foundation, and they all come from a sense of doing right, that things should be done right, lives should be protected. Then the divergence comes from the way they are theorized and the way their policy frameworks are written around them and drawn out and implemented around them. So I would say that I came face to face with that when I used to work in human rights education. that I increasingly, I would get challenged by the people that I was talking to about conventions. People would ask me, so if the Genocide Convention, came into being in 1948, so why did the genocide in Rwanda happen? So I got to a point where I started understanding this whole peace versus justice agenda from the space in which first that it's very difficult to work from the human rights perspective. It's extremely difficult to work with perpetrators to solve violence. But in peace building, those are the people you need to discuss peace. In their hands, the whole peace and the whole war. So then in peace building, I learned that you have to identify the person with the highest capacity to cause violence, because that's the person that you then need to sit with to solve issues. But in human rights, it doesn't work that way. And when you do conflict analysis, then you just realize that it is completely similar to laying out atrocity prevention or human rights complaints. And ultimately, then you get to the space where you see that you are the contestation, and I'm still on human rights and conflict and atrocity prevention. The contestation then is usually mainly around what is morally right and what is legally right. So, like, for example, apartheid was law, and therefore it was legally right. So then you find that in many cases that the position of the oppressed is sometimes not covered by existing law, even if human rights law is very, very strong in terms of specifying what is covered and what is not covered. So it brings me back to the earlier question that people kept asking me, why did the genocide happen in Rwanda yet the convention existed? That sometimes there is a moral gap. And this moral gap then provides and also closes spaces for peace building and atrocity prevention efforts, so that sometimes people may exploit this moral gap by closing all efforts towards peace building or atrocity prevention. But at the same time, the same moral gap can be the reason why a peace builder is then more accepted. So in terms of peace building and atrocity prevention, I see conflict prevention, violent conflict prevention, atrocity prevention, I see both building on each other. It's just a matter of terminology. Of course, atrocities define much bigger crimes than just violence, and so preventing violence may be the first step towards preventing atrocities. But there's a clear definition of atrocities in terms of genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. So at the basis of it all, the foundation is really to prevent loss of human life. And I think then the difference becomes how we interpret that.
Thank you. So correct me if I'm wrong, Alice, but I believe you were working for the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights when electoral violence erupted in Kenya in 2007 and 2008. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned from that experience?
Electoral violence happened when I was working at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and in 2005, there was a precedence in 2005 because we had a constitutional referendum, and the constitutional referendum of 2005 was very characterized by very, very divisive issues between ethnic communities in Kenya. And then working at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, when the referendum was over, we wrote a report, and the report was on hate speech. The report was on what had really divided the country. And it became very clear to us, like, the risk factors in place for violence in the next elections existed. And we had a chairman who had the foresight to tell us, all these things that we are doing will all be dismantled unless we prevent violence in the coming elections. So he said, we are going to drop everything we are doing, and we are just going to concentrate on ensuring that we work towards that. So I was involved in a very, very intensive effort of trying to do that, but from a human rights, not a peace building perspective. So we did what people do in human rights. We did education, we did around the coming election. We did advocacy, lots of advocacy. We spoke to a lot of people. And the lesson that I took away from that was that when ethnic identity, or I would say any form of identity, including religious, when it's hijacked by politicians and they construct a political narrative around it, then it becomes extremely difficult to extract it back from the politicians. That the politicians are able to take narratives, they're able to create narratives, they're able to craft narratives, they're able to take a narrative of especially of our community's shared trauma or shared glory, and translate it, weaponize it, and it becomes extremely difficult to take it back. So as we went into the election, we kept saying there's going to be violence, there's going to be violence, and our chair was on the media, and so are we, and nobody listened to us. And then there was violence. So that taught me the power of a politician to hijack an identity narrative.
This is such an important thing to highlight, this idea of the centrality of narratives and how politicians use narratives to play off the emotions of people that can possibly serve as a trigger for violence. Now, I'm wondering, the following elections in Kenya in 2013, now they're often highlighted as an example of successful prevention work in action, and also an example of successful engagement with R2P that didn't involve military intervention. How did that work? What lessons can we learn from the success of 2013? And how did you see the lessons from 2007, specifically relating to narratives, influencing the response in 2013 that was relatively successful?
When the violence then happened, as we had predicted in 2007, December 31st, the violence began. It went on until February 28th, and 2 very long months in our history as a country. And within that space, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, and Grasa Machel and the former president of Tanzania, Mkapa, came to Kenya, and they came to lead a mediation process. And this mediation process is the one you've just described as a successful engagement with the responsibility to protect that did not result in military intervention. And how it worked was that when they came on board, they set up 4 very clear agendas, which they communicated to Kenyans, which was a really good thing. So their first agenda was to stop the violence. The second agenda was to ensure humanitarian access. And then the third agenda was power sharing. And then the fourth agenda was the long-term issues, to deal with the long-term agendas, the issues that were affecting the country. So I was privileged then because in terms of dealing with the long-term agendas, the Kofi Annan-led team created a number of commissions. So there was a commission that investigated the electoral violence. There was a commission that investigated the whole election itself in terms of the voting and the tallying and everything else that went into it. There was a Truth and Justice Commission. There was a commission that wrote a new constitution. There was a constitution that worked on boundaries. And there was a constitution that was the only permanent commission that was created out of all this, because all of them had short timelines. You needed, the commission that wrote a constitution had a timeline, write the constitution and leave, investigate, the other one investigate the elections and leave. So the only one that didn't have a timeline, the only one that was permanent, was the National Cohesion and Integration Commission. And it dealt with the issues to do with ethnic relations in Kenya. And I say I was privileged because I became a commissioner in that commission. So I was directly involved in implementing what was decided. So in relation to responsibility to protect has three pillars. And the first pillar is that every state has the responsibility to protect its populations from the four mass atrocity crimes, which is genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And failure for the state to do that, then pillar 2 comes into place, which is that the wider international community has the responsibility to encourage and assist individual states in meeting that responsibility. So that's what Kofi Annan and the team did. They came and helped Kenya to meet the responsibility of protecting its populations from atrocity crimes. So that's why we say that R2P in Kenya did not resort in military intervention, which pillar 3 speaks to if the state fails, and then the international community, if the state completely fails to protect its population, then the international community then must be prepared to take appropriate collective action. And that collective action would include military intervention. And luckily for us in Kenya, that did not happen because Pillar 2 was able to solve the issues that we had.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Uiano Platform for Peace, what it is, how it came about, and what its goals are?
The Uiano Platform for Peace came about, I think, in the second year after I had been working at the NCIC. And we came together. We initially came together with, there was a gentleman who was working for UNDP. His name is Dr. Ozonia Ojello. And Ozonia is currently the resident coordinator for Kyrgyzstan. And at that time, he was working for UNDP in Kenya. And we came together and had this conversation. We were coming from different perspectives. I was coming from the perspective of, I was haunted because each time we went out to the field as the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, and when I'm talking about the field, I'm talking about a Kenya that had been so devastated by violence then. And I kept hearing people saying, we knew the violence was going to come, but we did not know who to tell. And I began to think to myself that really ensuring that people know who to tell must then become a very key reason why I am working in this National Cohesion and Integration Commission. And I had a very strong sense of my presence in that commission because I hadn't been propelled there by anyone. I didn't have godfathers or godmothers. I just applied. And then I appeared before a parliamentary committee. I was interviewed and I became a commissioner. And I used to find it completely unbelievable that I didn't have any political connections and I had found myself in that space. And I often felt I have to do something about being in that particular space. So then Ozonia also now, he knew the language of early warning. At that time, I did not know the language of early warning. Then we spoke to the head of the National Steering Committee, SK Minor, and he too said, yes, we need to do something about this little space. We need to find a way to come into this space. And then we then thought about a partnership. What about if we created partnerships? A partnership between a government commission, that's our commission, and then SK Minor was working in mainstream governments, and then Ozonia was in UN, so he could help us to mobilize for funding, and then civil society. So for civil society, then we went looking for Mutuku Nguli, who was in charge of national steering, he was in charge of, I forget, PeaceNet, PeaceNet, the network. So he had more than 500 civil society organizations he was coordinating. So we spoke to him. And then, of course, all these ideas were still up in the air and we didn't even know what to call what we'd put together. So we looked for Dixon Magotsi, who you would know he's the vice chair of the Genocide Prevention Committee of Kenya at the moment, and explained those ideas to him. And Dixon really has a way of taking things and putting them on paper. And Dixon presented to us the concepts with the whole, all the ideas, but then we didn't have a name. And then finally, after discussing, and then Ozonia asked, but what does cohesion mean in Kiswahili? And we said Uiano. So it became the Uiano Platform for Peace. So its goals really were to very, very clearly link early warning and early response. Because if people were saying they knew they were going to be attacked, but they didn't know what to tell, it meant that we had early warning. But what about the response? In a country without 911, how do you ensure that there is response? So we decided to build a partnership of national actors to address issues in regard to the prevention of conflict. During the referendum that I just spoke about, no, another one, sorry, the 2010 referendum, the one I spoke about earlier was the 2005, and then the elections period that was coming up in 2013. So we decided that the key thing was to strengthen our early warning and early response mechanisms at all levels, from the community level to the national level, so that then that would serve as a support mechanism for effective conflict prevention intervention. And then we thought that in so doing, then we'd be able to establish a very solid foundation for national cohesion and integration for the whole country. And it worked very well. It was very practical. We bought lots of cell phones. We distributed them in hotspot areas. We had a toll-free number you could call in. You had to key in the word peace in case to begin the sentence. We programmed it that way. We had so many messages coming in from all over the country. We had a huge media campaign. We would ask people to look out through the window and tell us what they are seeing. And then people would tell us things like, I'm seeing people standing in small groups. I see schools are closed today. I see people are not going to the market. I see people, I've gone to the market and ethnic communities are not buying from each other. And in that way, we were able to build up risk factors, very contextual risk factors to each particular area. We went to the villages, we did conflict analysis with communities, so that at the end of the day, they really, really owned it. And that really, really laid a wonderful foundation for a peaceful election in 2013. And when you consider what we had come from in 2008, during the last elections in 2008, when you consider the issues that had driven the country apart, and when you consider that at that particular time, so many of the issues had not been resolved, from the boundaries. The Truth Commission report had just been out, but it hadn't been implemented, and things were still hanging in the air. So it's so much needed to be done in terms of bringing the country together, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of bringing even political actors together, so that then they could speak with one voice. And then, of course, the ICC process was going on as we were doing all that. So many factors came into place in terms of ensuring a peaceful election in 2013, but the Uiano Platform for Peace was really, really key to all that, either in front of the scenes or behind the scenes.
Alice, much of your work has focused on empowering and highlighting the role of women in peace building and prevention efforts. So I want to ask, why is a gender-sensitive lens necessary when working on atrocity prevention? And this connects to a question from one of our audience members, our friend, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, who asks, how will you get women meaningfully involved in the field of atrocity prevention and genocide prevention?
I've worked so hard in my life after in the last say decade and something or so, having worked in so many countries as a mediator of armed conflict. And in spaces where women are not included, in spaces where I have really had to fight. And when I say fight, I mean fight in so many strategic ways, different ways, to get myself heard and to get myself accepted as a mediator in communities that have not seen women mediating. And in spaces where I have learned that really, when people really have problems, when people have reached that space of mutually hurting stalemate, that in many cases, it usually doesn't require, what people need is not a man or a woman. What they need is a person with skills. And there are so many women with skills, And we have to create, we have a duty to create that space for women to get into those spaces. And why is it so? Because there are so many studies that have been done involving women that have shown that studies involving women, civil society, men, that have shown that when you involve women in any atrocity prevention, that results in greater stability in societies over the longer term. And I'm speaking about facts in terms of peace agreements, even being less likely to fail when both men and women participate in the process. And nothing I have seen suggests that the inclusion of women has negative implications for the durability of atrocity prevention. And, you know, we also need to include the women to reinforce positive incentives. The former first lady of respected leader and former First Lady Graça Machel, she said that when you give prominence to warring parties at the expense of involving the majority of the people, including women, you are then giving them rights to decide on behalf of others. In essence, you're actually rewarding them for having taken up arms. So when you have women and the women having taken up arms, and I know there are instances when women also take up arms, then we are reinforcing positive incentives around the process. So I don't even need to, there are so many studies that have been done around how women have been integral in getting parties to speak and to negotiating tables and in ensuring that they remain committed to the process. Many of us probably know the story of the women from Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone who joined forces in 1999, the Mano River Network, and where they faced the three presidents who had vowed never to talk to one another. And they told them, you have to speak. And one of them said, I'm locking this door and I'm sitting on the key until you speak to each other. And, you know, we know about Liberia. All of us have watched, I think, what happened with the work of the women in Liberia. They were recognized even at the Nobel level. In Sri Lanka, we've seen women serving as bridges. In many places, in India, in Colombia, so many places we've seen women coming together to ensure that people stay and keep talking. And, you know, specifically, like in Darfur, I remember that women were credited for raising previously neglected issues that all parties could agree on. And those were issues such as food security and issues about water, how to get access to water, issues that were actually not on the table. So I would just say that in making this case for women in atrocity prevention, that women tend to broaden the set of issues addressed in negotiations beyond military action, power, and wealth sharing. And then in that sense, they address the issues, the underlying drivers of conflict. So to answer Ambassador Liberata's question in terms of what do we need to do, I have, in the 3 months I've been in office, I've been looking closely in terms of understanding what are the strategies that are there aimed at protecting women and girls at risk from atrocity crimes based on multifaceted female experience of violence, of genocidal violence, and thinking about how we can design processes to predict, to prevent, and also to build an early warning and early response capacity to atrocities that specifically reflect on women's experiences. And we've had a number of conversations. Right now, we had a webinar, I think about 2 weeks ago, on gender and the prevention of atrocity. So there are quite a number of ideas that are coming in. It's a neglected field, I must say, and knowing me, it is not a field that I will leave neglected in this space that have been provided to be in this office.
We've heard a lot today about the work that you've been involved in Kenya, but I know that you've also spent a lot of time in doing this work in other countries, for instance, Nigeria and Zambia in particular, as well as others. What can the rest of the world learn from Africa and the way that Africans are confronting the challenges of identity-based divisions?
Quite a bit. You know, there's always such negative reportage on Africa, and Africa always comes across as a continent with war and, with so many things that are going on. Yet, we need to refocus on quite a number of issues, and Africans have done that in a very efficient way. I was reading the book by James Waller about how it's societies that have been resilient throughout atrocities, how understudied they are. And my mind just went to my continent of Africa, that there are so many instances where we've been very resilient in the face of conflict, in the face of having so little. And that is something that needs to be studied. The other thing that we can teach the world is that there's quite a bit that has gone on in terms of communities coming together and putting together their own agreements of how they will live together. And it's something that right now many people are falling back to, trying to work, like here in the US, trying to work around communities, putting together communities of practice. We've done that quite efficiently in many parts of Africa. If you go to the northern Kenya and you find a whole swath that's actually governed by an agreement called the Modogashe agreement. Then there's the Maikona agreement, the Modogashe agreement that draws on cultural tradition to speak about what communities can do, what they cannot do in the event that there's any violence, what needs to happen to avert future violence. And all that has been completely, again, as not studied, yet it exists. There are quite a number of examples that exist. I have one of my peace building colleagues from Kenya at some point was trying to Ruto Kalia, Dominic, who was trying to study those kind of agreements that communities have across the continent in terms of how to coexist. So there's quite a bit of that out there. And then also we have the work, like for example, I did in Nigeria for so many years was completely African-led, 100%. We were all Africans sitting there, finding solutions for our continent together. And the last engagement I was involved in before I joined this office was in Liberia. And again, we were there as Africans in Liberia, working together to solve the issues of the continent. You know, there are so many indigenous approaches that are so underutilized. And and also that are so overwhelmed by the fact that there are so many guns on the continent, and that the issue of where the guns, the willing buyer, willing seller, that whole process is not addressed. And that gets completely overwhelmed in the face of how much work is done on the continent, how much unresearched work is done on the continent, how much, and when the research is done, in some cases, it's done to reflect a researcher's bias, so that when they do the research, then they actually can't believe that this community pulled off, this community, ethnic communities pulled off something so powerful between themselves in terms of deciding on how to peacefully coexist, that then it doesn't get out there. Some gets out. For example, the Wajir process, the Modogashe Declaration and the Wajir process led by Deka Ibrahim Abdi, the late Deka Ibrahim Abdi, is much read and actually examined in universities like the Eastern Mennonite University. So there's quite a bit that Africa has to teach the world. And you know, the pandemic has changed so many things. The pandemic has opened to the world a world of imagination. And even as we appear that we are getting closer and closer to going back to what used to happen before when we could go to offices and we could intermingle. I do hope that the world has learned quite a bit in terms of lessons on inequalities and communal living, because in Africa, a lot of people wouldn't be alive now if we didn't have that very strong sense of community, where you know that you don't even have a cousin, it's a cousin sister. You have to take care of somebody at any given time. You have to take care of each other. So there's a lot that can be learned from the continent.
Here's a related question from my colleague at the Auschwitz Institute, Ashad Sentongo, who asks, from an Africa perspective, how do you see the role of cultural leaders and traditions in atrocity prevention, and how can that role be positioned within the international system?
The cultural leaders are, of course, extremely powerful, and even in places where people, their different cultures have come together, you often find that in many instances, culture usually reigns. And I think one of the best examples is the work that we did in Nigeria. It was powerful for me because I come from a country that doesn't have traditional chiefs anymore. We have chiefs who are government chiefs after colonization. Then we no longer had traditional chiefs. But I went to work in Nigeria in a place where the traditional chiefs are very strong and very powerful, and we could go to them. And one of the ways that was very powerful, that proved to be very powerful to me in terms of the work of traditional leaders, is that they can make decisions that can completely reverse the way a community sees things. So, like, for example, when I went to Nigeria, we used to have these sessions where only men would come to the peace processes. And then my initial work in Nigeria was actually to get women into a peace process, because I had been part of the peace process in Nakuru and I was the only woman among 100 men. So I took the skills of what it meant to be that woman there to Nigeria. So we were working. Initially, we had our own women's meetings. We had our own women's agreement. And then when I then took over the next process that began, and the first process was between 8 ethnic communities, and we were able to bring women into the process by speaking to traditional leaders, by saying to them, give us the following people. These are the people we need for us to end this violence. We need this category of people. We laid out to them the number of people, including women, including youth. So because of the power of traditional leaders, we were able to move that. And then at the end of the day, also Ashad, my good friend Ashad, will know that in the African context, when people sign agreements, it doesn't have the weight that it has in the Western world. For us, culture is very strong, and we need to bring in a cultural aspect for a peace agreement to hold. And and when I'm talking about a peace agreement, of course, I'm talking about a peace agreement that speaks about atrocity prevention. And that I've seen that working in a number of instances. In Nakuru, the Nakuru process, we got to a point where we had the peace agreement and it was written, but before it was signed, we handed it over to the elders from the warring ethnic communities, and they went with it, and they had a cultural they organized something from a cultural perspective, including sacrificial lambs, and they then blessed that document. And that's so strong. So when it eventually came back to us and they said, even if we don't sign it, this is the agreement. We are not fighting anymore. It's not happening anymore. So that is very, very strong. But often we tend to run towards working with peace agreements. We tend to run towards cut and pasting, you find, if you do a study of peace agreements, and I have, you find so much similar language across different contexts, and then you see how much cut and paste there is involved in all that. But at the end of the day, if we bring culture in, nothing, when ethnic communities decide that they will not fight anymore from a cultural perspective, then that holds.
That's such an interesting lesson to learn. So now let's turn to your new position. I'll start with the big question. As the newly appointed special advisor on the prevention of genocide, what priorities do you have for the office of the special advisor on the prevention of genocide?
You know, in terms of priorities, of course, this is something also that has kept me awake for quite a long time since I heard about this happening, and it has also kept me consulting. I've been speaking to quite a number of people to just understand what it is that I need to prioritize on. And we know that my predecessors did a very, very good job. And my predecessors, Yuan Mendez and Francis Deng and Adama Dieng, they did a really good job in terms of laying out an international framework and regional framework and a national framework for understanding the prevention of genocide and what states need to do and then what regional bodies need to do. So in thinking about my priorities, my experience has guided me quite a bit. And I was thinking that when I was working in Nigeria and in Kenya and in Liberia, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in the Philippines, in Myanmar, that all the time I've been working with communities in conflict. And I didn't, despite the fact that I was a member of Kenya's Genocide Prevention Committee, I never made the connection between what communities can do to the whole agenda of the prevention of genocide. So thinking about all those people, and as I keep saying, my phone is still ringing. It's still ringing from the ground. I got a call the other day from Darfur just before the violence happened, and they were telling me this is what's going to happen and like, what can we do? So I'm in the position that I was in when I was in Kenya, and I was hearing people saying we knew the violence was going to come, but we didn't know who to tell. So I'm in the same position again, but of course, on a global scale, where there are lots of communities in the world who know violence is going to come. They do not know who to tell. They do not know how to link what they know with early response. They do not know how that early response looks like. So I will, of course, begin with the framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, a tool for prevention, which is on our website, which is a document that every single special advisor before me has worked on. And I will look at that document in terms of saying how we can take into account contextual situations and strengthen response and translate clear and early warnings, of course, based on a very clear and rigorous methodology to ensure that we take very decisive actions that will then lead us to very clear and early responses. So to do so requires, of course, identifying policy and advocacy processes within our field, the field of genocide prevention, with the potential for most impact at the community level. And then having done so, work to build traction for locally led genocide and atrocity prevention initiatives. And much of this will be by strengthening the professional competencies of grassroots community organizations. I will work to support intercommunal dialogue and existing and even create new ones in atrocity prevention initiatives in context-specific hotspots and flashpoints to begin with. And of course, all this, the UN gives me a very good framework to do so because we have the SDGs. And the SDGs, I always say that every failed sustainable development goal, the SDGs, is actually a risk factor for atrocity. So we will work, working across agencies. I've been in so many meetings since I came on board. I spend all my time in meetings, meeting not just leaders from different countries, but also meeting leaders from different UN agencies. So working to develop that network that will enable that development of community strategies and plans of action on not just hate speech, plans of action for religious leaders and actors, because that's work that's already been done by the office, and plans of action to prevent incitement to atrocity crimes. So ultimately, I'm hoping that together, all of us who work on the prevention of genocide, that we shall build a movement of global grassroots community of practitioners, evaluators and academics who initiate research, who share best practices on analysis, design, monitoring, evaluation of genocide prevention programs at community levels. And that speaks also to the question that Ashad asked. And ultimately, we shall, of course, work to produce indigenous research and homegrown knowledge on factors that affect results, that affect results that have been obtained through other prevention approaches. And I'm talking about that in the sense that I've been involved in so many peace processes. And again, research hasn't been done in terms of factors. And if it's been done, it's not been much. Factors that affect the results obtained, not the peace process itself, by various prevention approaches. And then, of course, showcase what kind of actions we can contribute most towards prevention of genocide and other atrocity crimes, and then putting all that together to translate this research into relevant policy findings. And of course, I come from a space of being huge concern that we have quite a number of states that have not ratified the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. And that then is absolutely important that that happens. And then also I also plan to do a lot of work with education, on education. And we have lots of plans for that with UNESCO, that we need to work to build capacities. For me, it concerns me a great deal that we haven't worked out a way in which we interrupt that cycle of socialization where a child is growing up and they are getting socialized into hating other people. And when they get socialized into hating other people, some people end up hating other people. Some people end up not hating other people. What is it that is done to those who do not hate other people? How do we interrupt that cycle of socialization that ensures that a person grows up to hate? So of course, there are so many ways that we can work around that, and education is just one of the ways. And of course, I know that the power of parents, in ensuring that some of these hate messages are reinforced is very, very powerful. But I also believe in the power of an education system that works to ensure that we interrupt this cycle. So we will work to, already UNESCO is working on developing programs for teachers on citizenship education. So what we need to do is enforce that by working to develop programs for teachers, specifically to understand what hate is and what its roots are, what constitutes hate speech, for example, because no single genocide, not the Holocaust, nothing has happened without hate speech. Give real skills to learners and to teachers themselves on how to combat hate and to recognize conflict triggers, in basic mediation and negotiation skills. And then I worry too about the fact that history is dropping out of so many contexts, so many places. History is dropping out of what is taught. So increasing support around teaching history, especially history of all ethnic groups, is very, very powerful. So the whole, of course, there are so many other things that come out of those key ideas. But speaking just briefly, because we don't have so much time, I'd just like to say that that I really would want to work on those particular issues. That is really what is driving me right now.
So just a few things. So there's a lot to talk about there. I want to come back to a lot of these points. But first, I want to talk about your focus on early warning, which is incredibly important, obviously. But to also just throw in the obvious is that we're speaking in a moment when genocides and other mass atrocities are actively occurring in far too many places, from the recent military coup in Myanmar and the ongoing genocide of the Rohingya, to what many are now acknowledging is the active genocide of the Uyghurs in China, to ongoing identity-based violence in the DRC, Cameroon, Syria, and too many more places. What is the role of the UN in responding to these crises, to midstream prevention? And this relates to a question from a participant, an audience member, Adam Carroll, who says, many impacted communities often feel betrayed by the bureaucracy of the UN and its slow response and inadequate response. So what do we say to the people who are living in the midst of crisis?
I would understand exactly what they would be feeling, because I say that will be the space that I am coming from, of ensuring that those who are in those kind of spaces get help and get help quickly. And I also understand that we've come from a very brutal legacy, from the genocide in Rwanda and in Srebrenica and all these other events that underlined not just the profound failure of individual states to live up to their responsibilities, but also the collective inadequacies of international institutions. And the UN responded to that particular failure by creating this office that I now sit in. And these tragedies, of course, press the need for a collective response that would protect populations. So, and speaks to the earlier issue that I had spoken about in terms of not just prevention of genocide, but also of responsibility to protect. So one of our key roles is early warning. And what we do is that the office picks up all this information, analyzes it, and then advises the Secretary General and through him the Security Council in terms of the issues that are going on. So sometimes it may not be so visible, because some of these things we don't do them openly. It may not be so visible, the kind of things that we are doing in terms of early warning, but I can assure you that quite a bit happens on a daily basis in our office in terms of ensuring that early warning is happening. And we know how do we do this, because there are warning signs. We look at the common risk factors, and in all aspects, the structural and dynamic. We look at news reports. We look at anything that can lead to the enabling of commission of atrocity crimes. And so therefore, then our work then becomes to advise, and then the Secretary General and the Security Council takes action. So I do understand where a lot of people who are in situations that are going on would be at, in terms of trying to understand how long will it take before anything happens. But then also at the same time, I also understand the system that the UN works in terms of verifying information, and in a very methodical way before then taking action. So I've been 3 months in this office. So, and I've picked up quite a bit. I've done so much reading and I've spoken to so many people in terms of understanding then how best to quicken this system. And there's quite a bit going on. So like, for example, on Myanmar, we have a special envoy who is been working on this and who's actually been trying to get to the ground and has been trying to get to the ground and not succeeding. And there are so many factors that come into this issue. So I will not speak to specific issues, but just to know that a lot happens behind the scenes that's not quite visible to everybody out there.
I want to come back now to your focus on engaging communities and working at the local level for atrocity prevention. This relates to a question that we got from Franco Chiere from the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, and who we're also going to be having next year as a resident practitioner at Binghamton. The UN is largely consigned to dealing with states in promoting atrocity prevention globally, but for the African continent, this has created a huge disconnect between rhetoric and implementation, as most states have demonstrated a lack of will to institute measures to protect populations. What can the Office of the Special Advisor do to promote grassroots prevention in Africa and elsewhere, really?
In Africa, I think lots is already happening, even within this space that I have been in office. It hasn't all been learning. We've actually been able to already begin working with communities in the African continent. We have an ongoing process in Mali. We have another one that I think just began yesterday in Nigeria, bringing together 5 states in Nigeria on the issues of farmers and herders. We have also worked through the UN resident coordinators, and through them, then get access to the community. So like, for example, in Ethiopia right now, we already even have the Ethiopia, the RC, the resident coordinator in Ethiopia has already developed an action plan on hate speech. And the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission itself, which is very connected to the grassroots, is actually working very closely with us in terms of developing whole community action plans between ethnic communities in conflict. So there's a lot that's really going on already. Last week, we had the Genocide Prevention Committee in DRC had a meeting, and they are going to roll out a very extensive community work in like around the whole expanse of the DRC. It's the community with the largest membership because the DRC is very large. So there are so many things that are going on. So many things that are going on. So we have the genocide prevention committees, and which many people probably would not be aware of. Quite a number of them are involved in working on very concrete policy measures, like, for example, drafting genocide prevention of genocide bills, and they're also involved in helping us around work on how to ratify the Convention on Genocide. But at the same time, we've had very extensive meetings with them in terms of how to best move this agenda forward to communities. How do we work with communities? So there's a lot going on through the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example. There are human rights commissions in every country. So then reaching those human rights commissions and the human rights commissions, both government, civil society, like working with everyone. And I can only say that maybe we need to have this same conversation 1 year down the line and talk about what has been done and what hasn't been done, because I can assure you that I'm devoting a huge amount of my energy to ensuring that communities around the world, not just in Africa, even in Ukraine, In Pakistan, I just came from the meeting with Pakistan this morning, in India, even in the US, in so many places around the world. So it's, you can be sure that quite a number of things are rolling and will keep rolling.
Okay, Alice, we're putting it on the calendar. March 2022, we have another conversation where we talk about what's happened.
Yes, absolutely.
You've laid out a lot of goals that you have over that next year and beyond. This is a question from my colleague here at the Institute at Binghamton, Nadia Rubai, who's asking, one, what criteria will you use to measure your success in this position? And two, how can those of us in the academy who are doing research, who are doing education work, how can we help you to do your job more effectively?
The UN has its own criteria in terms of assessing whether work has been done. And of course, that is based on the mandate. What is done is that they look at the mandate and they see how well the mandate of the office was implemented. But over and above that, of course, I come into this space having spoken about whom I am as a human being and the kind of work that I have done before. I come into this space knowing that that may not be enough, because in terms of assessments, you'll be looking at what the communities themselves, the people that we work for, what they themselves feel about us, whether they feel we connected with them, whether they feel that we have been able to do anything that is practical, that is tangible, that change their lives. So we will institute a whole evaluation process of everything that we undertake, so that whatever community that we are working with, we will have mechanisms for them to evaluate us, bottom-up mechanisms. And also, not just them, but we'll also have independent evaluators coming in, including the people who are on this call, who are people who would be willing to work with us. So you'd ask for evaluation, and you'd ask also how people can work to help. This work of prevention of atrocity, there's something about genocides that make people either afraid. There are some countries I have learned in these 3 months where we can't even say the word genocide. People are very sensitive to the word. So we talk about prevention of atrocities. And so there's something about that word genocide that people think it's either a historical event or it's something that happens to other people in Rwanda and during the Holocaust, and they don't relate it to themselves. And of course, I worry all the time about that. And I keep talking about this plaque that I saw at the Rwandan genocide museum in Kigali. When you're walking out, right at the end, there's this little plaque. And it has very profound words, because it says that people often assume that a genocide is something that happens when millions are killed. So they fail to see that it starts with 20 today, 30 tomorrow, 41, and then 3, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7, and then soon you have 1 million on your hands. So often so much loss of life that's completely discredited. People burying people in religious conflict, in conflicts between identities. And life just goes on. People do not see that these numbers add up. So the work of genocide prevention is work that we all need to get involved in. It's work that should not have any competition, because there's so much of it to be done. There's so much of it to be done. We need to work very hard to build the capacities of peace builders, especially to go a notch higher and work towards preventing atrocity crimes, so that we just don't stop at peace building. We need to do a lot more work in terms of bringing together human rights activists and peace builders. The whole peace versus justice dynamic is a dynamic that needs to find a way, find a course in the prevention of atrocity crimes. And there's so much work to be done around that. I've saved that for next year. But this particular year, I want to begin with communities. But for next year, I really want to focus on working on bringing together human rights and peace building actors.
There are several questions from the audience relating to the role of children in atrocity prevention. One comes from Laura Cleve from the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, who's asking, are there early warning indicators related to children that you've identified in the emergence of atrocity crimes? So that's about sort of early warning. But then some other questions, for instance, from Robin Cook on how do we get young people, children, learning about and involved in atrocity prevention? So thinking both about perpetration and prevention, the role of children.
You know, we just had a conversation about, I think 3 weeks ago with Najat, who is the USG for Children in Armed Conflict. And we were talking about exactly that, how we need to develop very specific information around the same way we focus so much on adults and prevention, early warning, linking early warning to early response, how we need to do that for children. And it's something that we are putting together around. If it exists, and I wouldn't know because I've not been old enough in the system to know like everything that exists. And she too hasn't been around for very long. So, but if it exists, then it's something we could build up on. There's this very great report by Grassa Michelle on children in armed conflict that is now more than 10 years old and is still so relevant. And it identifies actually those risk factors, something that we could really build on. And at the same time, one of the things that I keep discussing with our team is what to do in terms of engaging people, what to do so that the only people who are interested in genocide prevention are not just academics and researchers, because increasingly all the time the people who are reaching out are academics and researchers, yet the ordinary person who needs to be asking these kind of questions is not asking these questions, including in places where atrocities are happening. But you realize, even as we speak in this conversation, that there really is a gap in terms of people who are actually in situations of conflict. And you know, genocides don't only happen during war. So I'm not actually just not specifying them alone. But there's a very huge gap in the world in terms of understanding that all this violence we see is actually the root of atrocity. So there's a very huge disconnect. And when people use the word genocide, sometimes it's used politically. So you find people saying there's a genocide against us. And then, of course, you know, the law has not contributed in like there's been no unpackaging in terms of why it's so difficult to certify that an atrocity is a genocide. So many dynamics to walk around, but meanwhile, we have to ensure that communities around the world know who to tell when they know the violence is coming.
Here's a question from Prabha Sankaranarayan, who has said that your technical expertise has really influenced the development of the first early warning, early response platform in the US. Prabha's asking, can you speak about what key factors you see US peace builders needing to pay attention to at this critical time in this democracy, and what needs to be done to link atrocity prevention and peace building in this deeply divided society?
Thank you, Prabha, and I'm glad you're here. We did so much work with Prabha, with her organization Mediators Beyond Borders, to prevent violence before the US elections, the elections that have just happened. And we carried out, I think we did lots of conflict analysis. And I think we were the first to start beginning that, like on a very large scale, should hold webinars and bring about 500 people into the webinar, and we'd be working out all these plans. So I think right now I see first the US, I think for a long time has almost felt like it survives on its own, like it's kind of its own world. And this brought this whole experience of working on conflict analysis for the US. Um, some of the key messages that we were passing across was that there are so many lessons to be learned from other parts of the world. In Africa, we know quite a lot about conflict analysis. We know a lot about, and not just Africa, in many of the countries in the global south that have been involved, Colombia, that have been involved in violence, quite a bit that we know about conflict analysis and risk factors and how to ensure neighbors live together. I think right now, I feel in the US that a window of opportunity exists, and the windows sometimes close. So it would have to be, this window asks for a US-led um, um, discussion, a US-led conflict analysis of what is it that we thought could have brought the US to electoral violence, and have those issues been solved? And if they haven't been solved, how can they be solved? And so it calls for a very, very interactive conversation. I think, Prabha, you should continue the conversations you are having. It would be great to engage with you, to partner and continue this engagement, so that at the end of the day, we have to keep this conversation going, because I've seen it happen in other contexts where you think that there'll be a violent election, and then the violence doesn't happen in the way you imagined it would. And then you feel like, oh, we didn't fall apart. Everybody said we would fall apart. Then we didn't fall apart. And then you just move on, and then you just continue. So I'm reminded of the words of when Desmond Tutu was opening the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission. And I was there, and I remember him talking about a wound. He said, sometimes you have a wound, and then you may be tempted to just put a bandage on it and hope that it heals. And then he said, but it will only fester underneath, and you'll become sicker and sicker. And the day you'll remove that bandage, you'll have to clean out the soil in that wound. You'll have to clean out the pus in that wound, and it will be much, much more painful. So, and he talked about that Truth Commission, and he said, I need you to understand that this Truth Commission has just removed the bandage, and this is going to be painful, and we have to clean this wound. And we have the cleaning, the removing the soil, the pus will be painful, and then we have to stitch it. So really, that would be my advice, Prabha, for the US, that there's a wound to be cleaned, and it needs to be cleaned when the window of opportunity is still open.
Here's a related question from Tibby Gallus, the executive director of the Auschwitz Institute. During the last few years, risk of atrocity crimes has been increasing, not just in the US, but in many states in the global north. These states have traditionally been looking at atrocity prevention as a foreign policy issue. And this is made visible by the fact that most often their atrocity prevention or R2P focal points are located in their ministries of foreign affairs. What is your message to these states in the global north who do not yet engage domestically with atrocity prevention in spite of increasing risks of atrocity crimes?
I think, again, I would refer them again to the lessons that we took from Rwanda and Srebrenica. That after Rwanda and Srebrenica happened, and I have again reread Kofi Annan's book, Interventions. I have read it many times since I got into this position, because I needed to really, really understand what informed the creation of the Office of the Prevention of Genocide, what informed the office of the creation of the Office of Responsibility to Protect. So extremely important for those states to keep revisiting the intentions of these offices, why they were created, and what led us there, and how we said never again of course, in repetition of what had been said in the during the genocide, that it's extremely important to see this as not something just functional, just something that is just that's just a policy document that can gather files, can gather dust on a shelf, that this is really the practical life of people. I often wish that we could find a way to write out or even put together in a very simple way that doesn't require too much attention, very strong messages around why we are preventing genocide in the first place, what somebody like Raphael Lemkin had to do to even get the Convention of Genocide in place, and for people in government to understand really that basic lesson from the plaque in the museum in Ronda, that genocides don't happen when 1 million people die, that it's so many people dying here and so many people and so many other people dying. And also to understand that really the primary responsibility for protecting citizens is with the state. So there must be a way we must find to pass that message across. And I think, again, that the pandemic offers that opportunity. People are more willing to listen now. And again, I'm worried that the window of the pandemic may close. More willing to listen to the fact that an inequality in another country affects you, even if you're not suffering that inequality in your country. That an injustice in another country affects you, even if you're not suffering from that injustice in your country. So there's a very huge sense for me in terms of how can we communicate better, because usually it's not that people do not want to prevent genocide if they can, but when the interpretation of the prevention of genocide is then interpreted from that perspective of a national government, then inevitably then the national government will find a space to put it into, and then it belongs in there.
Greg Stanton, the president of Genocide Watch, is asking, drawing on your experience in Nigeria, what advice would you have for stopping the atrocities committed by Boko Haram and other jihadists there? And I think this can even be expanded to think about the increasing number of non-state actors who are perpetrating atrocities. How can the office engage on those levels?
Often when we speak about those non-state actors, most of the cases, it depends on whether they are operating in a space where the rule of law can be effected or not. So that, like, for example, thinking about Syria, for example, if, for example, we said we need to have the rule of law in Syria, it would be almost impossible to hold all those militias to account, and that one really does need an international approach. But at the same time, in many other contexts, what just needs to be enhanced is examining the rule of law, examining security sector reform, what needs to be done to ensure security sector reform, so that then the security can be able to actually manage all those kinds of militias. But over and beyond that, it goes back to that interruption of the socialization that I was speaking about earlier. Because however many times, however well armed any government is in terms of curbing something like Boko Haram, it becomes extremely difficult to do so if the people you're working with, the militias are coming from a space where it's so easy to socialize young people into believing these wrong ideas. So I think investing heavily in messaging, investing heavily, I've seen quite a lot of work done around counter narratives. I've seen quite a lot of work done around, for example, specifically on Boko Haram, I've seen work done around where the militias, for example, misinterpret religious texts to mean something else. I've seen a lot of people going around saying this is the correct version of the religious text. You shouldn't believe that. Lots of work is also being done in we call them madrasas in Kenya, and also for Christians as well, in other religious organizations, in terms of the places where religion is taught. So lots of work is being done around that. But the voices from outside are very, very important. People need to hear alternative voices other than the ones that they're hearing that are just teaching them to keep doing that thing that then leads them into becoming militias.
And we spend a lot of time talking about upstream and midstream prevention. I want to end with a final question to sort of summarize several questions we've gotten from the audience about downstream prevention. And can you talk a little bit about the importance of memory and remembrance in the aftermath of atrocity and the role that it can play in prevention and why it's also important?
You know, memory is key to preventing atrocities. And I remember at some point in my own country in Kenya, in Nakuru, we were having a discussion in the peace process around how to remember. And there had been a Catholic priest who had been killed, and the Catholic Church set up a monument in his remembrance. And the local communities were saying, this monument is not a very good reminder of what happened. Now that we have peace, can we remove it? And I remember telling them, then I asked them, would you like to go to Rwanda and see what happened there? They said yes. And then I said, why do you want to go to Rwanda then? If you don't want to have your own monument, why would you want to go to Rwanda? But there's a reason why so many people go to Rwanda, because they go to Rwanda to see a display of what happened there that should never happen again. There's a reason why, and I thank the Auschwitz Institute for introducing to me this whole idea of the power of place. There's a reason why people go to Auschwitz, to walk around there and get horrified by what happened. Because personally, for me, like my need, my great desire to work on genocide prevention was really reinforced by walking around the museum in Auschwitz and seeing, because I wear glasses and I've worn glasses since I was a small child. When I saw that pile of glasses and I imagined what it felt to walk to your death, like you can't even see, like me, I virtually can hardly see. And also when you go to South Africa and you go to the Apartheid Museum and they give you the passes, you know, you're either black or you're white. So then you walk in and then you go through the whole museum and you get the experience of either being black or being white in the apartheid system. It's so powerful. I don't know how to explain in ways that people can understand how the power of monuments and memorials are, because each time we say never again, but we have nothing solid, concrete we can look at to remind us of what we are saying never again to, then it just gets lost. And then the following year, we are again saying, here we are again meeting to say never again. So in terms of ensuring that future generations even know what happened and understand it so that it never happens to them again, memory is extremely important. Monuments are extremely important. Museums are extremely important. And it's a space that we must keep investing in. We must keep investing. For me, when we could travel, each time I traveled, you know, the way they say that when you go to a country, what is the first thing what's the thing you feel you must see? For me, it's always been a museum. I always try to find the nearest museum and walk into it and see, because that's where you gain the knowledge of the country, you gain the knowledge of what's going on.
Thank you so much. My apologies to all of the people whose questions we couldn't get to. There were so many, but we're at the end of our time together. Alice Nderitu, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's really been an honor to hear you speak, and we're so excited to reconvene a year from now and to have you look back at what you accomplished over the next year. I'm certainly excited to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm so sorry that I couldn't even read like all the questions and answer all the questions. Of course, I'm available to keep engaging. I want to thank everyone who came and listened today. I want to say that our doors are open in terms of ideas, in terms of partnerships, in terms of what we can do together, and that really there is that this work of preventing genocide, it's so urgent and it's so much, there's so much of it. So please, let's work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I want to remind you that our next webinar will be on Friday, April 16th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And that's going to be on risk and realities of mass atrocities facing Brazil's indigenous peoples. That will be available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. And we look forward to seeing each other and talking to each other again soon. Thank you so much, Alice.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.